After hundreds of years of occupation, many generations of people in Britain had grown up surrounded by Roman culture. And after a long period of stability, that culture was showing visible signs of wealth, success, and good living. This fabulous mansion, Littlecote House, was built nearly 500 years ago by Sir Edward Darrell. The family must have had some status because one of their relations was a girl called Jane Seymour, and she was courted right here in the 1530s by Henry VIII. Most people think that Tudor mansions like this were the earliest stately homes in Britain. But what even the Darrells didn't realise was that right at the bottom of their garden there had been another luxury villa built 1200 years earlier by a member of the landed gentry in Roman Britain. These flint walls show a layout that was typical of the Roman villas that were springing up all over the country in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. What amazes me is that in some respects this place was more advanced technologically than the Tudor mansion next door. We think it may have looked a bit like this. It's obviously a very substantial house, stone built, 2 floors with 3 in the turrets and probably a tiled roof. Now in the roof there would probably be in the servants' quarters and then up here somewhere bedrooms and so on. 1 floor down you can see these are the main reception rooms with wonderful mosaic floors, really beautiful, in at least 3 of the rooms. And the high-tech bit comes underneath those floors. Have a look at this. Here we have the hypercaust, the central heating system, with a furnace here and perhaps here, and then the hot air and the smoke and the fumes being drawn out all the way through all these gaps under the floors and up the vents into the roof. Every villa would have had its wonderful mosaic floors. Unfortunately, the ones in the main house have long gone, but down at the other end of the building, one of these wonderful floors survives. This fabulous mosaic was once the floor of a room that must have been devoted to ceremonials. I reckon the Romans must have come in here to pay tribute to their gods, the gods of good living. Now, the chap in the middle of the circle there is Orpheus, the celebrated poet and musician. And around him there are 4 other deities, including Venus, the goddess of spring and rebirth, and Leda, who represents summer and youth. And look over here. There are in this panel a couple of panthers. Now, they were traditionally Bacchus's companions. Bacchus was the god of wine. And you see between them there is a great flagon of wine overflowing, which suggests that these ceremonies they had involved a lot of feasting and probably drinking. I wish I'd been here, actually. Mosaics were the standard floor covering for the wealthy. At Fishbourne Palace, one of the most sumptuous residences in Europe, there was room after room of them, each with a different pattern, and some laid one on top of the other, like covering old lino with new. The most important design was usually in the middle of the room. We think this was the dining room. And you see here is Cupid riding on a dolphin carrying a toasting fork. And the mosaicist would work out from here towards the borders, and he'd probably leave his minions to do the less important bits, because if there were mistakes out there, they'd all get covered up by the furniture. Lavish decoration extended out of the home and into the ornamental gardens too. We think of the concept of having a garden for pleasure as being a very British thing, but we got it from the Romans. The Celts were using the land around their houses to grow crops, but the wealthy Romans wanted what they had at home: herb gardens, fish ponds, fountains, statues. This recreation shows what a Roman garden may have looked like. But the gardens weren't just pretty to look at. The Romans introduced to Britain a whole pantry full of herbs, vegetables and fruit. Look at this. Turnips, for example. Apples and pears, amazingly, brought to this country by the Romans. Celery, carrots, asparagus, and above all, grapes. The Romans loved their wine. They tried to grow grapes practically wherever they went, and there's evidence of vineyards as far north as Lincoln. In a world where safe drinking water was hard to find, Romans drank masses of wine and planted vines in their thousands. Getting from vine to bottle is quite a complicated business. To begin with, you have to extract the juice from the grapes. You do that first by treading them, which gives you cold feet and a sort of mushy pulp. Then you take that mushy pulp and you put it in a press to squeeze out more of the juice. For centuries they used a lever press. This early type of press used a heavy weight at the end of a beam. However, even with the extra weight of a small boy, the press often failed to exert enough pressure. To solve this problem, the Romans came up with a fantastic high-tech solution. And we've set carpenter Henry Russell the challenge of building it. It's a screw press, where a threaded rod passes through a top beam. To tackle the construction, Henry's roped in his twin brother John. They're using only the traditional tools and techniques available to the Romans, rounding the oak timber using a simple lathe. Next, John begins work cutting out the internal thread. He's already marked out a spiral on the thread cutter, which he's fitted with a blade. Henry's measuring out a spiral of the same pitch on the external thread and beginning the delicate work of cutting out the helix. The screw press is a fine bit of engineering, but its value is far greater than the Romans ever realised at the time. What they had unwittingly invented was the nut and bolt. So, here's the internal thread. The question is, will the screw fit? If the fit's not snug enough, the press won't work. Ah! Fantastic. That's really neat. Right. It was the Greeks who invented the screw in about the 5th century BC, but it took an unknown Roman to realise the screw's ability to exert pressure.
Put the braces in next.
Soon, both the Greeks and the Romans were using it to press the juice from olives and grapes, and it was also used to press water from clothes.
Lovely.
Right.
And there we go.
Lovely.
Yeah, the next thing is to assemble the basket and the press plate.
Right.
And at the bottom a tray to collect the juice.
Right. You think we're going to get some out of this, do you?
I hope so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Disgusting. Okay, I think you can shove the barrel down. The windlass arms are slotted into position. The press plate is lowered, and the press is ready for the final test.
It's pressing.
It certainly is. It's complaining a lot, isn't it? You bothered about going sideways? Yeah! It's squidging out. It's into me jug. Look, it's filling up with delicious nectar. Well, it's not quite wine yet, and it looks pretty horrible. Maybe there's some tar come off that barrel, but we've certainly got grape juice coming out. That's great. Probably more than anything else, what symbolised good living for the Romans was bathing. It wasn't just about washing, it was more a way of life. In bathhouses, they could meet friends, do business, exchange gossip, and of course, relax. This is the Great Pool at the bathing complex at Bath, or Aqua Sulis, as the Romans called it. Here, the Romans took bathing to the heights of luxury and sophistication. They took advantage of an existing natural hot spring, which was already a Celtic shrine, and converted it into a suite of baths with various different functions. These are the remains of a hot, steamy room, rather like a Turkish bath. And this is what's left of a hot, dry room, rather like a modern sauna. It's not surprising that the place where the water actually gushed out of the ground was regarded as a sacred place. Originally, it was dedicated to the Celtic goddess Sulis, but then the Romans came along with their goddess Minerva, and together they combined to create the super deity, Sulis Minerva. The baths are a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering. Today, most of the water's coming out in this single open channel. But 1800 years ago, there were pipes all over the place. Have a look, just here. This is an original Roman lead pipe. And if you look, it's got a wonderful seam along here where the edges have been rolled right over tightly. It looks to me as though they pumped the water along here at high pressure. When it emerged from the nozzle, it must have come with invigorating force, giving the people in this bath a terrific pummeling, which they couldn't have experienced again until the whirlpool bath was reinvented hundreds of years later.
Of course, Bath was special because it was sitting on top of its own hot spring. But in many other places, the passion for bathing meant they had to bring the water from miles away, and often somewhere quite high up, well above the local river, for example. So how did the Romans get their water? Well, by applying their ingenuity to building some of the finest examples of Roman engineering, the aqueducts.
Some of them were spectacular and even a little ostentatious, like the Pont du Gard at Nîmes in France. This three-tiered bridge over the valley carried not just water, but foot passengers and even chariots.
Other aqueducts were rather simpler. This green path running between the buttercups along this terrace which the Romans cut out of the hillside marks the position of an aqueduct which snaked its way all along this valley to the military bathhouse in Dorchester. But where did they get their water from? Well, the nearest source was the River Frome, but that was much too low down to be any use. What they needed was a good supply of clean water well above the level of the camp.
And what they eventually found was a stream 9 miles away. But the stream was only 10 metres higher than the camp at Dorchester, so their aqueduct had to follow the contours of the hill at a very shallow gradient. Archaeological evidence shows that the aqueduct was constructed of timber-lined channels dug into the hillside and covered over with removable lids topped by turf. It's been estimated that it could have supplied about 13 million gallons a day, more than enough to run several bathhouses and public fountains. This bathhouse is an exact copy of one at Chesters, a fort on Hadrian's Wall. It's the best preserved military bathhouse in Britain, and it was lavishly equipped. It follows the standard Roman system of cold, warm and hot rooms. And back at Wallsend, they've gone the whole hog with the furnace. But how did this extraordinary system work? Well, it's all down to that legendary Roman hypocaust. Right next to the hot room was a great big furnace, and the job of the slaves was to keep this furnace stoked up and blazing furiously. Now, the point of this fire was really twofold. First of all, it heated the water in a great big boiler on top, and that heated up the bath. But also, perhaps more important, if you look in the back there, you can see there's a long tunnel going away. That's where the smoke and the hot air go, and it goes into the hypocaust. And if you look very carefully on the left, you can just see the pili, the columns that are holding up the floor, and that's where all this heat is going to go. The hypocaust in this building is fully functional, but they've also built a separate section cut away so you can see how it works. And if you look down, you can see all the piles here, and you can see the flues where the hot air and smoke were drawn up the walls. So all the walls and the floor are wonderfully warm. Many of the bathhouses were beautifully decorated with frescoes. Oh, this has to be the frigidarium, the cold plunge pool. They probably would have started in here with a brief dip. Well, I love the fish, but I'm not quite sure about the water. Oh, you wouldn't want to spend too long in there. Heated rooms led off cold ones, some with floors so hot you couldn't walk on them. And from there, there'd be a whole range of steam rooms, Turkish baths and saunas. Of course, one of the things you'd want to do in a bathhouse is get clean. But to get clean, the Romans didn't use soap. Instead, they used olive oil. And what they would do is to pour it on their skin, just like this, just a little bit, and then rub it in, so it would mix with all the sweat. They've got a nice sweat up now. And then they would take this thing, which is called a strigo, a metal scraper, and they would scrape it off like this. And what comes off is a mixture of all the olive oil and all the dirt that's been pushed out of the pores by the sweat. Now this gloop, if it came from athletes and gladiators, was highly prized by ladies who used to collect it and make it into a face pack to collect all that youth and vigour. And then there was the Caldarium, the hot room. It's really nice in here. The floor's hot, the walls are warm, and the water, well, it's just like a hot bath. It's lovely. Imagine quite a lot of people in here all having a great time together. You could gamble, you could play board games with your friends. There were snacks like oysters and wine. It was a terrific place for relaxing after all the rigours of camp life. Sometimes we imagine that we invented bathing for pleasure, but the Romans had it all sussed 2,000 years ago. For the wealthy, an afternoon in the bathhouse would be followed by the main meal of the day, and I'm not one to break with tradition.
Sally, hello.
Hello,
What are you
hi.
doing here?
Food historian and chef Sally Granger has agreed to rustle up a Roman banquet for me. Sally's making a stuffing from pepper, coriander, pine kernels and fennel seeds, ground together in a mortarium, a bowl with grit fired into the surface of the clay, which makes short work of grinding spices.
Stop now, because I need to get the call.
Right. The stuffing goes into kidneys, which are then treated to a rather unusual process. They're wrapped in pig's caul. That's the thin white membrane that holds the animal's guts in place. Oh, thanks.
Yes, we've all got it. but
Right.
This is the pigs.
Right. OK, so what are you going to do with that?
Well, this is used to wrap the kidney and stop the stuffing escaping. So basically, you lie it down.
All Sally's cooking implements are based on archaeological finds, and some are really ingeniously designed.
We need the frying pan. Can you pass it to me?
Yep. That's a very bizarre thing.
Isn't it wonderful? Very,
Oh, I
very
see.
efficient.
And
yes.
it locks up like that.
Locks in place. Almost certainly army issue.
Ah, now on the
Light
fire.
it on the fire, please.
Right.
A little bit of olive oil,
Right.
and then we fry off our kidney.
You don't need to get it too hot first.
I imagine it'll get hot extremely quickly.
Will it?
I can feel the heat off this fire.
Gas mark 5. 20 minutes.
20 minutes or so, it'll
No
be cooked
problem.
through. Right, one whole salmon. I'm now going to stuff it with some bay leaves.
And on to the next course.
Conveniently positioned
Fish
behind
or
me.
meat would have been the main feature of the Roman banquet. They had no potatoes, no rice, no pasta, and they hadn't yet invented the pizza.
We wrap.
So this salmon is like a second course.
It's the main course, yes, yes.
Right.
The Romans actually had 3 courses, just as we do. In fact, I think they probably invented it.
Right, it's 3-course meal.
3
So
courses.
what about the Celts? What did they have?
Well, I suppose technically they had one pot cookery. They had a cauldron or they had a spit. And so you had whatever you had and you put it in your pot. And it was bean and grain and meat and vegetable.
Sort of Scotch
Stew.
broth, basically.
Pottage. One
One of the distinctive features of Roman cuisine was the number of different flavours they used. And that just goes straight in, does it? This pudding is made from pears cooked in red wine with raisins and eggs. And there's another, more surprising ingredient. What's that?
This is the Roman fish sauce.
Fish sauce to the pudding?
Yes, it's like adding salt. It works very well, don't worry.
You're sure?
I promise you.
How do you know they had fish sauce?
There is a recipe text that has survived from the ancient world.
A Roman cookbook?
Roman cookbook, yes. It's attributed to a man called Apicius, who was a gourmet. And it has food from all manner of different types of food, mainly wealthy, very spicy, 450 recipes. Actually works wonderfully with fish sauce. I know it's strange.
OK, fish custard. I can't wait.
No, you'll like it, I promise.
An hour later, and dinner is served in true Roman style in the outdoor dining room.
Ah, wow, that looks terrific. Now, what do we start with?
Start with our stuffed kidneys.
Okay.
So I'm going to cut you a piece. You tell me what you think.
Lovely. Now, I don't have a knife and fork, do I?
No, the Romans would eat with their fingers.
With the fingers?
They did not have forks.
Okay, no forks?
No forks at all.
Right.
Teaspoons, yes, but not forks.
Hey, that's really good.
And now for that salmon wrapped in vine leaves. Oh, the
There
salmon,
we
great.
go.
That looks wonderful. I shall just break a little bit off. That's really nice. Succulent, sweet, great. Now, how about the pudding?
Ah,
Now, this is the custard with fish sauce, which I'm a bit dubious about. Oh, that's rather good. It's got quite a sharp taste. I would expect a custard thing to be pure sweet, but this is sweet with a sort of sour cutting thing through it. Yes, I like that. I'm not entirely convinced that I'll put fish in my custard in the future, but nevertheless, this is very pleasant. Washed down with a little glass of wine.
The delights of dinner parties, hot baths and central heating were lost once the Romans left Britain, and it was to be many centuries before we regained such a life of luxury.
When the Romans focused the might of their military machine on the ancient Britons, it was no wonder resistance was weak. Adam looks at the engineering skills behind their warmongering next on History.